They tried to evict me from my home, but I didn't just come back with a legal document. I came back with the proof that their perfect son was murdered, and I'm the only one left who knows the whole, terrible truth. The silence in the cavernous living room was thick enough to chew on, heavy with the scent of old potpourri and stale resentment. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon sun, slicing through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the battlefield upon which I stood. Across the expanse of antique Persian rug, Margaret sat ramrod straight on the Queen Anne sofa, her face a mask of icy entitlement. Beside her, Arthur, her husband and my former father-in-law, fidgeted with his cufflinks, the only sign of his unease betraying the facade of control he desperately tried to maintain. "Honestly, Eleanor," Margaret began, her voice a perfectly modulated instrument of condescension, "this has gone on long enough. You've been here 6 months since the separation. 6 months is more than generous." Generous? The word tasted like ash. 6 months since my marriage to their son, David, had imploded under the weight of his secrets and lies. 6 months of walking on eggshells in the house that was supposed to be my home, too. This wasn't just any house. This was the ancestral seat, the sprawling, ivy-covered monument to the Sterling family legacy. I'd poured 5 years of my life, my energy, and every spare penny of my savings into this place during those 5 years of marriage. I'd painted the sunroom, wrestled the stubborn rose bushes into submission, and even managed to convince the notoriously temperamental boiler to cooperate through the harshest winter on record. All for them. All for David. "Generous?" I echoed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor deep in my stomach. I clutched the worn leather briefcase tighter against my side. Inside it was the only thing of value I had left, the truth. "Margaret, this is where I lived as David's wife. I have as much right to be here as you do." Arthur finally cleared his throat, the sound abrasive in the quiet room. "Legally, Eleanor, that is precisely the point we need to discuss. David is finalizing the divorce papers. He wants you out, effective immediately. We've hired a solicitor to handle the proceedings, and frankly, they concur. It's time for you to move on." "Move on," I repeated, the cliche grinding against my nerves. "And where exactly am I supposed to move on to, Arthur? I relocated my entire life for this marriage. I left my career opportunities 3 states away. You know this." Margaret sighed dramatically, leaning back as if the sheer effort of dealing with me was exhausting her. "We are prepared to offer you a final settlement, a very substantial one, considering the circumstances, enough to get you started somewhere new. A clean break, Eleanor. That's what everyone wants." They wanted a clean break. They wanted to sweep away the messy, inconvenient fact that their perfect son had shattered his vows, leaving behind a woman who knew too many of the family's less savory dealings. They wanted me gone before the whispers grew too loud. They wanted me gone before I asked the hard questions about the offshore accounts or the shady property deals David inherited from his father. "You misunderstand," I said, taking a slow step forward, my heels clicking sharply on the polished wood floor, the sound like a single gunshot in the tense atmosphere. "I'm not interested in your settlement, Margaret. I don't need a payoff to forget what happened." Arthur frowned, sensing the shift in my demeanor. "Then what is it you want, Eleanor? We are trying to be reasonable." I let the briefcase drop to the floor with a solid thud. The sound seemed to rattle the porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece. I looked from Margaret's judgmental glare to Arthur's thinly veiled panic, and a cold, exhilarating clarity washed over me. All those late nights spent studying the mortgage documents, the trust agreements, the Byzantine network of sterling finances that David had carelessly left open on his study computer, they weren't for nothing. "I want the house," I stated, my voice low and ringing with conviction. Margaret actually laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. You cannot possibly afford this property. It's worth millions. David's name is on the primary deed, and when he files the divorce, you walk away with what the court deems equitable distribution." "Ah, but that's where you're relying on outdated information, my dear former in-laws," I countered, allowing a slow, triumphant smile to spread across my face. I reached down, pulled the worn briefcase open, and carefully extracted a single, official-looking document. The edges softened from constant handling. The paper crackled as I unfolded it beneath the sunlight. You see, while David was busy ensuring his name was the primary one on the deed for mortgage purposes, he overlooked something very important when we refinanced 3 years ago. A little clause that David himself insisted upon signing, thinking it was just boilerplate legalese. I held the document up, letting the stark black text leap out at them. Arthur leaned forward, squinting, his composure finally cracking. Margaret's face had gone bone white. "What is that?" Arthur demanded, his voice suddenly weak. I tapped a perfectly manicured nail against a specific line of dense legal script. "It's a contingency clause, Arthur. A very specific, very binding contingency clause designed to protect my equity contribution in the event of a dissolution of marriage. It states clearly, unequivocally, that in the event of divorce, the property ownership transfers entirely and without contest to the party who has resided in and maintained the property for a continuous period exceeding 5 years. If that party can demonstrate sole management of all household upkeep and financial stewardship during the final year of residency." I met Margaret's horrified gaze directly. "And I have receipts for every single drop of paint, every boiler repair, and every property tax payment made from my personal savings account for the last 12 months. I let the silence stretch, watching their world crumble around them. Then I delivered the final blow. "The house isn't David's anymore. It's mine. And I'm not just asking you to leave. I'm telling you that if you're still standing on this property in 24 hours, I will have the sheriff remove you for trespassing. Now, do you want to gather your personal effects quietly, or shall I call my attorney to formally serve you with the eviction notice?" The sudden, absolute reversal of power hung in the air, so palpable it seemed to vibrate the crystal chandelier overhead. Margaret's gasp was sharp and involuntary, a tiny, pathetic sound that belied her usual glacial composure. Arthur, however, recovered marginally faster, his inherited sterling arrogance kicking in even as his face drained of color. He snatched the document from my hand before I could stop him, his eyes darting frantically over the fine print. This is preposterous. David would never have agreed to anything so reckless," Arthur spluttered, waving the paper as if it were contaminated. "This clause is void. We will challenge it in court. You think a mere clause in a refinancing agreement trumps the title held by the primary owner?" "He agreed because he trusted me, Arthur," I said, my voice gaining a dangerous, almost hypnotic rhythm. I walked slowly towards the grand mahogany fireplace, running my fingers along the cool marble mantelpiece, an area I'd spent an entire weekend restoring. He trusted that I wouldn't look too closely, just as you both trusted that I was too emotionally devastated after discovering his affair to scrutinize the legal paperwork I signed. Margaret finally found her voice, and it was laced with pure venom. "You manipulative viper! You played the grieving wife while secretly plotting to steal our family home? David was weak, yes, but you are a cold-blooded opportunist." I turned back to face them, not flinching under the verbal assault. "Call it what you like, Margaret. I call it self-preservation. You wanted me gone? Fine. But I am not leaving empty-handed, and I am certainly not leaving homeless, especially when I have a legally binding document proving that this house secured my future, not David's." Arthur slammed the document back onto the coffee table. "We are not leaving. This is our home, Eleanor. You have no authority here until a judge reviews this ridiculous piece of paper. And trust me, we have enough money to bury you in litigation for the next decade." "Litigation is expensive, Arthur, and tedious," I replied smoothly, "especially when the opposing counsel has absolute proof of the terms of agreement already in hand. Furthermore, challenging this clause now would mean digging through all of David's financial dealings from the last 5 years to prove malfeasance or coercion, wouldn't it?" That hit a nerve. The The Sterling family's wealth wasn't built on pristine honesty. David's infidelity was just the visible crack. The foundation was riddled with decades of questionable tax dodges and undeclared assets. "You wouldn't dare," Margaret whispered, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "You wouldn't bring external scrutiny onto the family just to spite us." "Watch me," I challenged, leaning against the mantelpiece, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the last 6 months lift, replaced by pure adrenaline. "I have nothing left to lose, Margaret. You tried to discard me like yesterday's newspaper. Now you deal with the consequences of that arrogance." Arthur began pacing, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. The situation had spiraled far beyond a simple divorce negotiation. It was now a siege. "You leave us no choice, Eleanor. We are calling David. He will tell you this is invalid. He will explain how you misunderstood the terms." "Call him," I invited, spreading my hands wide. "Go ahead. He's been conveniently unreachable since he left town last Tuesday. But while you're waiting for his call, perhaps you should consider the alternative. 24 hours. The keys to the safe deposit box holding the original will, the one that names you as executors, will be exchanged for your immediate voluntary surrender of this property and a signed, notarized agreement confirming the deed transfer to me. Free and clear of any Sterling lien," Margaret shrieked, rising from the sofa. "The will? You wouldn't know where the safe deposit box is. David handles all that." "Oh, I know where it is, Margaret. I know where David keeps everything," I said, my smile fading, replaced by something hard and unreadable. "I know where he keeps his secrets, and I know where he keeps the key to the safety deposit box. I know because he showed me months ago when he was drunk and trying to apologize for his first betrayal. He called it insurance against his parents." I walked back toward the briefcase, my steps deliberate. "And the insurance policy, it seems, has now expired in your favor, Arthur and Margaret." I paused with my hand hovering over the handle. "But there's one last detail you might not have accounted for in your initial eviction threat." Arthur stopped pacing, frozen mid-stride. "What detail, Eleanor? What else could there possibly be?" I straightened up, meeting their terrified eyes one last time before turning toward the front door. "The timeline. You gave me 24 hours to vacate. I agreed to the exchange within that time frame. However, the clause you're so worried about challenging, it has an interesting clause regarding my continued residency. It states that if I am forcibly removed or if my status as legal resident is threatened before the transfer is complete, the ownership defaults immediately to a non-family entity designated in the accompanying trust document." I opened the door just wide enough to let the cool evening air sweep in. "I didn't sign that trust document, Margaret. David did. And the designated non-family entity? It's the firm that specialized in handling asset protection for my other business partner." Margaret's composure shattered entirely. "Your other partner? What other partner? You don't have a business partner." I paused on the threshold, turning back one last time. The late afternoon shadows had deepened, turning the grand hall into a place of sinister secrets. "Oh, I do. And he's very interested in prime real estate in this county. In fact, he's been waiting for my signal." "The only signal that matters now," I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket, its screen glowing faintly, "is the one that tells him he can send his retrieval team over. And they aren't interested in arguing over fine print." I looked down at the screen, where a single unread text message pulsed from an unknown number. I knew exactly who it was from. The text read simply, "Package secured, ETA 10 minutes. Hold the line." I looked up at my former in-laws, both now pale statues of shock. "They should be here any minute now. I suggest you decide very quickly which set of keys you're handing over." The air in the foyer was electric, humming with the unspoken threat of imminent, unseen consequences. Margaret stared at my phone screen as if it were a vial of poison, her breathing shallow and rapid. Arthur, rigid and pale, seemed to be wrestling with the terrifying reality that his son's convenient cover story, that I was just an emotional, easily manipulated ex-wife, had been a catastrophic miscalculation. "Who is this?" Who are you working with? Arthur finally choked out, his voice stripped of its authority, sounding desperately fragile. David would never have allowed you to bring outsiders into this. This is family property. I deliberately didn't look at the phone again, focusing instead on the terror blooming in their eyes. David allowed many things, Arthur. He allowed me to manage the books, he allowed me to believe his reassurances, and he allowed me to sign papers he never bothered to read himself. When you leverage everything you have against someone who has nothing left to lose, you create a monster, or in this case, a very efficient executor of pre-agreed financial maneuvers. I took a single step back toward the front door, the cool evening breeze now feeling almost welcoming. The retrieval team isn't here to negotiate possession, Arthur. They are here to secure the asset under the terms of the trust agreement. They are professionals, and they operate on very strict timelines. 10 minutes is not a lot of time to decide whether you want to meet them on the front porch or explain to them why you're still inside their new acquisition. Margaret suddenly lunged, not toward me, but toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, screaming something incoherent about calling the police. "I'm calling 911. You are trespassing now, Eleanor. You are threatening us with thugs." But before she could reach the landline phone tucked away on a dusty console table, a sound ripped through the quiet suburban evening, a sound utterly alien to this neighborhood of manicured lawns and hushed conservations. It wasn't a police siren. It was the deep, throaty rumble of heavy-duty engines slowing just outside the property line, followed by the sharp, distinct thunk of multiple car doors slamming in unison. Arthur looked out the large bay window, his face contorting in a silent scream. "They're here. They're actually here." I glanced out. 3 large, unmarked black SUVs were positioned strategically, effectively blocking the Sterling's driveway and one partially blocking the street access. Men in dark, practical clothing were already exiting the vehicles, moving with a practiced efficiency that spoke volumes about their intentions and their lack of patience. They weren't police. They looked like a highly specialized private security detail. "See? Punctual," I murmured, a perverse sense of satisfaction warming me. "Now, the exchange. I need the safe deposit keys and the signed waiver confirming the deed transfer. You have approximately 5 minutes before I signal them that the occupants are resisting surrender of property to the rightful owner." The tension was unbearable. Margaret was sobbing openly now, clinging to Arthur's arm. They were trapped between the legal threat I held and the physical reality parked outside. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. He seemed to realize that any confrontation with these men would end very badly for him, regardless of the legality of the deed. He stumbled toward a small, ornate liquor cabinet near the entrance, clearly looking for the hidden compartment David had always used for important documents. "The keys are here," Arthur whispered hoarsely, pulling out a small, heavy brass key, the kind meant for old-fashioned strongboxes, and a sheaf of papers he'd clearly had tucked away in a desk drawer, ready for the divorce negotiation. He smoothed out the top paper. "Here, the waiver. It states we vacate within 48 hours, and the deed transfer starts immediately upon filing with the county office." I took the key and the waiver. The waiver looked legitimate enough, but I wasn't concerned with the 48 hours. I was concerned with the keys. I pocketed the brass key. "Excellent choice, Arthur. A wise decision," I conceded, turning toward the door where the shadows of the approaching men were now visible through the thick glass pane. "Now, get what you need for the next 2 days. My solicitor will be in touch regarding the transfer of utilities." As I reached for the door handle, preparing to step outside and signal the all clear to the retrieval team, Margaret let out a shriek that echoed through the hall, far louder and more piercing than her earlier outburst. "You won't get away with this, Eleanor. You think you're so clever, but you forgot the one thing David really didn't want his parents to find." She lunged again, this time not at the phone, but at the mantelpiece where I had been leaning moments before. Her fingers scrabbled frantically at the marble, pushing aside a heavy bronze clock. Beneath the clock, not a hidden safe, but a small, almost invisible seam in the masonry was revealed. Margaret jammed her fingers into the crack and pulled. With a grinding sound of ancient stone shifting, a narrow, shallow compartment swung open, revealing not jewelry nor cash, but a single thick, leather-bound journal, secured with a small silver clasp. Margaret clutched it to her chest, breathing heavily, her eyes burning with a maniacal triumph that instantly eclipsed her fear. "You only found the financial insurance, Eleanor. David kept this here. This proves everything. His suicide wasn't an accident. It was murder, and you were the last person to see him alive." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and freezing the hand poised on the doorknob. The triumphant, almost insane glow in Margaret's eyes was more terrifying than any legal maneuvering or private security force could ever be. Murder. The word echoed in the sudden, profound silence, drowning out the muffled sounds of the heavily armed men waiting just outside the door. My mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the narrative I had constructed, the narrative of a calculated property grab based on meticulous financial records, with this explosive, wholly unexpected new element. David's death, officially ruled a tragic accident, a sudden heart failure while working late in his study, had been the foundation upon which my entire strategy rested. If that was a lie— "What are you talking about, Margaret?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a rasp. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt hot, worthless. The retrieval team outside felt like a distraction, an elaborate stage curtain masking the true, lethal drama unfolding within. Arthur, his face a mixture of terror and a sickening vindication, looked from his wife to me, finally understanding the magnitude of what she held. "Margaret, put that down. Now, you don't know what you're doing," he pleaded, trying to wrestle the journal from her grasp. She pulled back with surprising strength, hugging the leather volume tight against her chest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "He didn't have a heart attack, Arthur. He found out what you two have been doing with the overseas holdings. He threatened to go to the SEC. He was going to expose the entire scheme." Her voice cracked with genuine, agonizing grief now, layered over with fury. "And you made sure he couldn't talk." I stared at Arthur, searching his face for any flicker of guilt, any sign that the years of performance were finally collapsing. His expression was a battlefield, fear of the journal, fear of the men outside, and a deep primal fear of being implicated in his own son's death. "Eleanor, stop everything!" Arthur yelled toward the door, desperation overriding caution. "There's been a misunderstanding. We need a moment." But the retrieval team had been signaled. They didn't wait for permission. The heavy, reinforced front door shuddered violently as a powerful shoulder slammed against it. A splintering crack echoed through the foyer, the first point of breach. "They're coming in!" I yelled, though it was too late for retreat. I abandoned the door and backed toward the center of the room, grabbing the briefcase containing the deeds, ready to shield myself or use it as a weapon. The door burst inward with a deafening crash, hinges ripping free from the jamb. 3 figures flooded the entrance instantly. They weren't armed with pistols, but with heavy, silenced-looking tactical carbines held ready. Their eyes immediately scanned the scene, the overturned furniture, the hysterical woman clutching a book, the stunned old man, and me, standing defensively near the hearth. The leader, a man whose face was obscured by tactical gear, barked a single sharp command into his headset, his gaze locking onto Margaret. "Assets secured," he muttered into the mic, clearly reporting to whoever was pulling the strings on the outside. Then he directed his attention to Margaret, his voice low and gravelly, entirely devoid of emotion. "Drop the leather-bound object, madam. That is now the property of the trust." Margaret's eyes darted wildly between the armed men and me. She saw her opportunity, a chance to redirect the immediate threat away from herself and toward the one person who had triggered this entire event. Me. "It's not theirs!" she shrieked, suddenly pivoting. She didn't drop the journal. Instead, she hurled it with surprising force directly at my head. The heavy volume spun end over end, striking me squarely on the temple. The impact was stunningly hard. Stars exploded behind my eyes, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled backward, dropping the briefcase, my vision swimming as I crashed hard against the stone hearth, the bronze clock tumbling to the floor beside me with a loud clang. I fought to clear the fog, dimly aware of shouting and the heavy thud of tactical boots moving swiftly across the rug. The retrieval leader was already converging on Margaret, clearly prioritizing securing the physical evidence he was sent for. When my sight finally cleared, I saw Margaret being forcefully restrained by one of the men, struggling uselessly as they pried the journal from her grip. Arthur was cowering near the broken doorway, completely neutralized. And then I saw what had fallen from my impact with the hearth. The heavy bronze clock hadn't just fallen. It had knocked against the decorative iron fireguard, and in doing so, had revealed something hidden in the back corner of the fireplace recess, something dark, metallic, and utterly out of place. It was a small digital voice recorder nestled deep in the shadows, its tiny red recording light blinking steadily. As the retrieval leader finally secured the journal, he looked up, his expression shifting from professional focus to one of lethal confusion as he spotted the blinking red light near my head. He took a deliberate step away from Margaret and toward the hearth, his weapon swinging toward the new, unexpected evidence. "Stop! Don't touch that!" Margaret screamed, desperation overcoming her fear of the armed men. "That's the backup. If you open that, Eleanor, the whole story, the real one, comes out. Not just the finances, not just the murder, everything. Even the thing you did last summer that David was keeping secret." The red light on the voice recorder seemed to pulse in time, with my frantic heartbeat, a tiny, damning beacon in the gloom of the fireplace. Margaret's final, desperate cry, a frantic scramble to shift the focus of blame, had thrown a grenade into the already volatile situation. She wasn't just trying to save herself from the consequences of the journal. She was trying to bury another, far deeper secret, one that implicated me. The leader of the retrieval team paused, his weapon still pointed menacingly at the hearth, his tactical posture betraying a momentary confusion. The initial objective, the leather-bound journal detailing Arthur and Margaret's potential conspiracy in David's death, was secured, but this new evidence introduced an immediate and unacceptable complication. His orders were to secure the sterling assets and secrets under the trust. Anything that could expose the trust's primary beneficiary, me, to criminal liability was a catastrophic liability. "Hold position," the leader barked into his headset. His eyes narrowed, assessing the recorder. He didn't move toward it, understanding instantly that this small device held leverage potentially far greater than the journal he now possessed. I pushed myself up, ignoring the throbbing pain in my temple. The confrontation had boiled down to this: a deadly game of leverage, where every player held a card that could destroy the others, and myself included. I had come for the house, but now I was holding the detonator to the entire Sterling Empire, and perhaps my own freedom. I crawled slowly toward the device, keeping my movements deliberate, non-threatening, letting the armed men watch my every calculated inch. Arthur was sobbing silently, slumped against the doorframe, finally broken by the sheer speed and brutality of the exposure. When my fingertips finally brushed the cold, smooth plastic of the recorder, the retrieval leader barked sharply, "Do not touch that! Step away!" I ignored him, picking up the device. I didn't need to look at it. I knew exactly what it contained. David, ever the paranoid narcissist, had recorded everything. Not just his suspicions about his parents, but his own late-night confessions, his anxieties, and yes, his true assessment of my actions during those last volatile months of the marriage. The thing I did last summer, Margaret mentioned, it wasn't a crime, but it was a massive ethical breach, a secret that would destroy any claim I had to moral high ground and likely trigger a devastating prenuptial challenge based on bad faith. I rose slowly to my feet, holding the tiny recorder between my thumb and forefinger. I met the leader's gaze, bypassing the terrified Sterlings entirely. "Listen to me," I said, my voice clear, steady, and backed by an authority I hadn't known I possessed until this moment. You are here because I signed a document guaranteeing the transfer of the house based on the financial leverage I held over Arthur and Margaret. They are compliant. The journal, the one you just took, will prove they conspired against their son. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. This, I lifted the small recorder, is my insurance against my secret being exposed. The retrieval team's objective ends when the house is secured. However, if this device is taken, or if any of my personal information stored on it surfaces in the ensuing investigation, the trust agreement dissolves. The house transfers back to David's estate, meaning Arthur and Margaret get to keep it, and I face criminal inquiry for coercion and blackmail related to the journal. I gave him a small, dangerous smile. So, here is the new exchange. You leave the journal with me. You leave my house, cleanly, quietly, and without reporting any further complications to your principal. You have the deed transfer papers signed. That is your success. In exchange, I walk away with both the journal and this recording device, ensuring that only the financial crimes of the Sterlings are revealed to the authorities. Do we have an agreement, or do you want to bring down the entire Sterling dynasty, potentially taking me and your mission down with it? The tactical leader stared at me, a war raging behind the opaque visor of his helmet. He was caught between explicit orders, secure all incriminating evidence, and the immediate, tangible success, securing the house deed through my leverage. A compromised outcome was better than a total failure. He slowly lowered his weapon an inch. After a moment of tense silence, he nodded once, curtly. Journal. Now. I walked deliberately to Margaret, who was still being held, and gently pulled the leather-bound book from her numb fingers. I laid it on the coffee table next to the broken glass. Then I walked back to the leader and placed both the journal and the tiny voice recorder into his outstretched, gloved hand. "Get out," I commanded, my voice now ice. The leader didn't argue. He nodded to his team. Within 90 seconds, the armed men had melted back into the darkness, retreating to their black SUVs. The only evidence of their presence was the splintered front door hanging precariously on one hinge and the faint scent of ozone and professionalism lingering in the air. Arthur and Margaret were left staring at the space where the men had been, then slowly their eyes fixed on me, the woman they had tried to destroy. They were homeless, exposed, and now utterly powerless. I walked over to the ruined doorway, looking out at the empty street. The silence returned. Heavy, but this time, it was mine to command. I looked back at the two figures huddled in the wreckage of their legacy. "The house is mine," I stated, calmly surveying the damage. "I own it. And while you have 48 hours to gather your remaining belongings, I suggest you use that time wisely, because the key you gave me, the key to the safe deposit box with the will?" I reached into my pocket, retrieving the brass key. I held it up in the faint moonlight spilling through the broken entrance, letting the metal gleam. "I didn't lie about David keeping secrets from you, but the will inside that box isn't the one you think it is. David didn't just name you executors. He named me as the sole beneficiary of his personal estate, including the controlling shares of Sterling Holdings, which he signed over to me the day before his accident. You thought I was fighting for the house? No. I was fighting for the title deed to keep you out long enough to claim everything else." I walked toward the stairs, leaving them stranded amidst the ruin of their living room. "Enjoy your last 2 nights here, Arthur, because when the county clerk processes those papers tomorrow morning, the lawyers you plan to use against me will instead be working for me, and I intend to dismantle the rest of your empire brick by brick."